I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Peter Garretson, an independent strategy consultant focused on space and defense. Peter's accomplishments include a 33-year career with the Department of Defense and service in a number of prestigious roles, such as the Chief of Future Technology for the United States Air Force Strategic Planning in the Pentagon, the Director of the Space Horizons Task Force, and the Division Chief of Irregular Strategy, Plans, and Policy, as well as being Strategic Policy Advisor to the Chief of Staff to the Air Force. Peter has also served as an assistant professor of comparative military studies at the USAF Air Command and Staff College, as a member of the National Space Society Board of Directors, and in his current role as senior fellow in defense studies at the American Foreign Policy Council. Peter is also co-author of Scramble for the Skies, the great power competition to control the resources of outer space, and he joins us today to discuss a number of amazing issues, including Golden Dome. So, Pete, welcome back. We're doing Golden Dome today, man.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's great to be back with you.
So this is the anti-missile defense shield that was initiated under an executive order by Donald Trump on January 5th, 2025. It has been compared to both Israel's Iron Dome missile defense shield as well as the old SDI initiative from the 1980s. So let me start out with the basics. What is Golden Dome, and what are your high-level thoughts on it? Is this a good idea or overly ambitious?
Well, Tim, so what Golden Dome is right now is a policy decision on the part of this White House, and a major policy decision to pursue a missile defense shield for the U.S. homeland, with interactions with theater missile defense, but primarily for the U.S. homeland. And it is a remarkable change in policy. I think it's no exaggeration to say that this is the biggest change in arms control policy, nuclear policy, space policy, counter-space policy that we've seen in decades. You know, in many ways, because of its far-reaching potential impacts, the Iron Dome executive order is a change in political military doctrine on par with the creation of the Space Force.
Wow. So that is big. And I think in terms of technical achievements, also, once I started to look into the details of what this would involve, I realized technically this is going to be a massive change to space in general. My research shows that the White House has basically called this both a dome and a shield, but in practice, it's going to rely on thousands of space-based weapons called interceptors that are distributed around the Earth in low-flying orbits. And so it's not going to be kind of a fixed dome position over the United States, right? So you're going to have lots of stuff being transported up to space. And I think that is why it's going to change the space industry. And then these will circle at a low orbit, and if there is an adversary launch, right, then they will come down from orbit to tackle that, right?
Well, Tim, you've got that right. And you know, I want to say that the Golden Dome covers a lot of things, right? It covers missile sensing, it covers missile tracking, it covers terminal defenses. But those aren't really a change. What is a change is this idea that we want to be able to do what is called boost phase intercept from a proliferated constellation, which means a lot of them, of space-based interceptors. And you are right to characterize space-based interceptors as, you know, they're essentially, you know, missile seeker heads, you know, that, as you rightly point out, deorbit from space to strike the missile. And they do it, you know, essentially like throwing a stone at the missile. They kill entirely by hitting it at a very, very fast speed. So there's typically no explosion involved. It's just, you know, striking it kinetically. But this is a major change because, you know, the United States under previous administrations has been, you know, very dissuasive of sort of any change to sort of the mutually assured destruction doctrine, but also very averse to the idea of having any kind of kinetic interceptors in space because of their potential anti-satellite capabilities. Now, there has been no articulation from a policy standpoint that there is any desire on the administration to use these space-based interceptors in an anti-satellite mode. But to some extent, that's inherent and would have to be governed by policy and, the credibility of the United States to make such a policy. It's worth explaining why boost phase is important. You mentioned that we'd seen the first use of a Russian MIRV in combat. And what a MIRV is you use one rocket to launch multiple warheads. And so if you think about it from an economic perspective, do you want to spend money, and these might have like between 3 and 6 typically, I think in some cases maybe as many as 10 independent warheads. And so it's much more economical to hit one rocket while it's trying to get to space in the phase where it is boosting to orbit than to try to find 3 to 10 dark targets and hit them either as they're transiting through space in what's called mid-course or as they're raining down upon the United States in terminal defenses. And so hitting the missile while it's over the adversary terrain, before it ever gets up to speed, is also the easiest to do because you can see the missile when it's really, really bright. Now, as you brightly pointed out, this dome isn't over the United States. It is a mega constellation in space that can intercept a missile coming from anywhere in its boost phase, essentially, over or immediately adjacent to the launching state. And so this certainly offers the possibility of the United States extending that protection, to other nations if it so chose. But it seems that the White House is signaling strongly that this is sort of a, pay for the protection sort of, partnership, that there's a buy-in cost. It wouldn't be free. And that the primary purpose of this is to protect the United States, and specifically, and what is actually radically different, if you actually think about this, is this specifically talks about dissuading counter-value strike, and it specifically talks about assuring a survivable second strike capability, and it specifically talks about protecting American citizens and infrastructure. And that is a radically different ordering of priority than sort of previous military missile defense, which has been focused on sort of, protecting military facilities. Now, our ability to retaliate, the way I read that, is that there is a fear that with our adversaries getting proliferated hypersonic weapons that are currently difficult to track, super difficult to intercept, and don't even need to be nuclear, that it could be attractive to an adversary to attempt a decapitating strike on our nuclear command and control network. And that, the specific inclusion of that in the order leads me to believe that somebody was very concerned about this capability and wants to make sure that we can, attrit an inbound strike and make it less likely that you could have a offensive nuclear decapitating strike.
Well, Pete, since you mentioned the Russian launch, when I read the headline about the Oreshnik last November, my blood ran cold. I mean, that was the original headline, called it an ICBM. They dialed that back. Now they're calling it an intermediate range ballistic missile. But nonetheless, it's basically a slightly smaller version of the same thing. Now, it was non-nuclear, but we've got the first use of an ICBM in combat ever used right? And so that itself was big. And I wanted to go to why we need this now, because during the Cold War, the principle of mutually assured destruction assumed a rational adversary. But in today's world, we have rogue regimes like North Korea and Iran, and these are less predictable. We have things like the launch of the Oreshnik missile that kind of came out of nowhere, presumably because Russia was feeling desperate and wanted to make a statement, right? And so these things are scary, unpredictable, and impossible to foresee. So does this almost force our hand to create Golden Dome?
Well, Tim, many people have a variety of opinions about what is necessary or forced in terms of what we need to do. And sometimes even the same people can find, different areas that they're willing to trade. So, first of all, it's important to talk that in the first round of trying to create a space-based missile shield against nuclear weapons, it was Reagan's rejection of the MAD doctrine and thinking it was immoral to rely on the goodwill of an adversary not to strike your populace, and that the moral thing was to attempt to protect your populace. And I think this executive order makes a similar statement. So then you have to think that Reagan was sincere in wanting to put up such a shield, but he was willing to trade it away for very serious arms control that benefited the United States, right? And so I don't think it's impossible that this could be an opening ante by the Trump administration to a broader agenda to see if there's a willingness of our adversaries to limit the things that we find so threatening. And certainly those would include, MIRV hypersonics. It might include, the unchecked nuclear buildup of competitors like China. It might include intermediate range ballistic missiles that the Chinese have in vast numbers. And it might include, things like Russia's purported development of a nuclear weapon for in space, right? So it's not impossible to think that this might result in some other configuration, but certainly, this is a strong communication that the United States is not going to sit still while adversaries innovate in their ability to strike the homeland. And some of the things you didn't mention, Tim, is China's experimenting with space planes and fractional orbital bombardment systems. And those are a concern because basically all intercontinental ballistic missiles that would come at the United States sort of travel over the poles. And so we have radars that are configured to see that. But a fractional orbital bombardment system that does a partial orbit around the Earth can come from the south, where we have not set up any of our radars. And then the problem with hypersonic glide vehicles is that they boost just like any other missile, but then they follow what's called a depressed trajectory, where they skip along the high atmosphere, and they can maneuver across thousands of nautical miles of cross range. And, unlike a ballistic missile, which is like throwing a baseball, very easy to predict where you need to be to catch it. This is, more like somebody, throwing a quadcopter at you, that can maneuver all the way, to you. And, you may think you know where it's going, and then it can zip around at the last minute. So, these, and because these can be intercontinental, and, you would ask sort of about the analogy to Israel's Iron Dome. And so there are major differences because, of course, Israel's, working on these very short range, small ballistic missiles for the most part, that I don't think are typically exoatmospheric and have much lower velocities and energies. But fortunately for us, we are not having to defend the United States against missiles coming from Mexico or Canada. And so, and let's hope that we never see a day when our relations decay to that level. But so basically, anybody who's going to throw a missile at the American, continent is going to be coming from far away, probably Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. Now, you had mentioned sort of, North Korea and Iran and the proliferation of missiles by smaller third-party states.
Yeah.
But let me point out that has been a concern, since the 90s. So Donald Rumsfeld, before he did the Space Commission, led another commission on ballistic missile defense that brought up these exact problems. And so we today have a very limited missile defense that is, stationed at 2 sites in the United States and, a couple of overseas locations that, are meant only to be able to treat an accidental launch or, 1 or 2 missiles from basically Iran or North Korea. But so that's been a concern for a long time. But these are not space-based boost-phased interceptors, nor are they, the executive order is very clear that since we withdrew from the 2002 anti-ballistic missile treaty, our homeland missile policy has been only to stay ahead of rogue nation threats and accidental and unauthorized missile launches. And that now this order is very specifically considering the threat from next generation strategic weapons and the development by peer and near peer adversaries of next generation delivery systems. So it's very, very clear that, what the White House feels is forcing their hand are these new delivery systems and these hypersonic capabilities.
I appreciate your going through all of that. There are so many wheels within wheels here in terms of today's geopolitical climate. And I feel compelled to put in a plug for your book, Scramble for the Skies. Yourself and Dr. Namrata Goswami co-authored this, and it is coming true, right? We have more and more nations as well as private organizations entering space, and space is becoming far more complex as a result of that. Going back to mutually assured destruction, that idea was the U.S. versus Russia. And, we did have arms control talks. We had numerous meetings, and so there was this kind of rationale behind it, right? And as you mentioned, Reagan rejected that. But, fast forward to today, we have China, India, I believe Israel has at least some type of nuclear weapons. North Korea, I believe, has ballistic missiles. Iran
and
is
nuclear weapons.
Iran is attempting that, right? So we have at least those that we're aware of, and these countries don't all get along with each other, right? India and China are not best friends. China and Russia appear to be fair weather friends. And so the potential for a launch doesn't even necessarily include the United States. It might be one of these countries against another, but you might see rapid escalation and chaos. So again, in terms of Golden Dome, the more that I looked at this, I was like, you know what? There is a real reason that we could potentially use this, and a dire reason that we need it.
So, you mentioned, what in the international relations literature is sometimes called conflict dyads. So India, China, you didn't mention India, Pakistan. Japan is not a nuclear weapons state, but it could rapidly become one. Probably the same, for Poland or Ukraine. Then you've got, Israel versus Iran. You've got Iran versus Saudi Arabia, which may have, nukes on loan from Pakistan or is pursuing its own. It's very, very unknown. So, there are certainly possibilities around the world where one state could launch at another. And it is a curious capability if a power like the United States could deny that. And that has, Tim, pluses and minuses, right? obviously, on the plus side, the citizens of whatever country would be facing nuclear annihilation would be very happy that the United States came to their aid. On the other hand, the nation state that has built a nuclear weapon as a deterrent in order to see to their own security would be very unhappy to think that the United States was undermining their ability to counterstrike and secure their own security. So, putting up a defense shield like this has massive interactions across the board in ways that are, very difficult to forecast. And it goes beyond that, Tim, because there's this idea of what you might call moral deep pockets, right? Mm-hmm. Once the United States has put up such a shield and has the ability to intercept missiles, even if they're not nuclear missiles, are we obligated to use that to stop against somebody else? Because, for example, we come to the aid of Israel when Iran shoots them with missiles. And that's frankly costly to us. Every one of those that we have to use, is something that the either Israel is recompensing us for, or the American taxpayer has had to pay for, and similar with what's happening with NATO and Ukraine on Patriots. So it is possible, and that also can incentivize behavior, right? As we've seen with Iran striking, our own bases, right? If they know that we can basically defend ourselves, and therefore it's not going to be an extreme strike and cause lots of loss of life, and therefore the United States is unlikely to retaliate, that incentivizes them to show their anger by shooting such missiles. And so you have to worry that if such a shield exists, does that incentivize people to show their anger by throwing missiles, assuming that the United States will intercept them and that they can just rattle their saber without effect?
Well, I'm actually looking through my notes for some of the financial aspects of this also. But what you'd mentioned there goes to Iron Dome. One of the challenges is, I believe in the October 7th attacks, and I could be mistaken about the date on those, but you had Palestine throwing essentially $300 to $500 converted water pipes, right, that were built into these home-built rockets, and these were being intercepted by $40,000 Tamir missiles. And so that's a perfect example of it, where is that line drawn? But from what you'd said earlier, it sounds like the administration has already kind of outlined what this will be used to intercept. So it won't just be anything, it will be specific classes of weapons, right?
Well, Tim, there's an intent that you can infer from the Golden Dome executive order, but that is far from a declaratory policy of how it will be used, what it will be used for, what it will be used against, right? And I want to just point out that there are costs and benefits to clarity. So some people think that more clarity is always good, that it's just like, if you're going to use it this way, you should declare that in advance so that people know where the red line is. But if you've ever had kids, you know that if you draw a line and say, don't cross this, they're going to put their toes right up against that line, right up against it, right? So being ambiguous, might actually prevent, a lot of potential maluses. But although it may be useful to be ambiguous in your declaratory statements in public, it's probably good to have a very clear internal idea of how you think you would use this and not use this, and when you would want to communicate, hey, don't do that. That would be a concern.
Yeah. Well, so I did find my financial figures, and the White House estimated this system would cost $175 billion, which makes me go pale when I read that. Then the Congressional Budget Office came back with an estimate of around $831 billion, which is just painful to read. So it's an expensive project in the first place, right? And one of the things that I'd wondered about was maybe there's some offsets to this. Again, going back to your book, Scramble for the Skies, the more launches that happen, the more things that are put into space, the more those costs drop, the more that our expertise as a civilization in accessing space grows, right? And in a sense, that takes us more towards this moving out from the Earth, that we're all hoping will happen to reach that Star Trek future. So I'm wondering if Golden Dome, even though, I mean, again, we're pushing $1 trillion there in terms of cost, but maybe that will be offset by benefits to the commercial space industry and satellite launches and things like that. Do you think that there's potential there?
I absolutely do. And let me move my comments in two simultaneous directions here. The first is to say that, yeah, those are big numbers, but are they really, Tim? I mean, think about this. Let's say that you went with the uppermost estimate of $800 billion, right? Which is over 10 years, right? But if something cost you $800 billion or even $1 trillion, right? That is 1 year of your defense budget, right? And if you could spend 1 year of your defense budget and get a shield that protects all Americans and all global citizens from some limited nuclear strike, and for the first time actually would protect all American cities to include those in Puerto Rico and Alaska and Hawaii, as well as, further secure your overseas troops, wouldn't that be a bargain? 1 year of your defense budget that buys you, decades of that kind of additional security. So in terms of like what you're getting for your defense dollars, I'm not sure I find that so crazy. And then if you take the administration estimate of whatever it is, 175 billion over 10 years, I think, and you divide that by 10, that's like, 17 billion, right? That's not small. That's close to what the initial Space Force budget was when it was first there. But if you've got $1 trillion space budget, right? It's what, 1-2% of your defense budget? And is what we're doing overseas really as important as defending our citizens? So that, just to think about it in terms of like those giant numbers. But now let's talk about the question you really got. You were asking about like in terms of, what does having to put up, thousands of these, space-based interceptors to knock down missiles do, to our ability to, go out into the cosmos.
Well, Pete, if it's okay, let me interrupt a sec. If you could hold up the golden thing again for us. You mentioned that before the call. So that is from the Brilliant Pebbles program, which was the SDI version of this back in the 80s, right?
Yeah, this was one of the final sort of incarnation designs of what they were looking for the end interceptor. There are a couple of stages before this that accelerate this, but this is the sensor package and the rapid maneuvering capability that does the final terminal defense. And it would be small. I mean, obviously this is just a 3D printed model that give a shout out to Andre and Donald, who know who they are, for giving this to me. But that is only about like 10 kilograms altogether. And let me point out, Tim, that like Star Wars, the first time, is what gave us the current new space stage, right? A lot of people don't realize it, but it was the SDI investments in miniaturization, in computation, that had a huge impact on America, having the dominance in semiconductors and compute that it did, and in the tiny sensors that we have now, in our cell phones. And then, it was the investment in reusable launch through the DCX that made it possible for SpaceX to do what it did And it was very specifically the investment in these tiny satellites that gave us the small sat revolution, that allowed things like, Planet Labs and ultimately SpaceX Starlink to become a thing. And, and now we have the reverse. So back then, part of the cost that made the Star Wars so expensive the first time, SDI so expensive the first time, was the high cost of launch and the need to get to reusable launch, and the ability to produce, massive satellites at scale as part of a production line, right? Well, those two problems are actually already, solved. You can see in Starlink, how reusable launch combined with, satellite production lines have completely altered the cost of things. And so, we can expect that SpaceX and others, probably can in fact build such a system at scale in a way that, was hard to completely contemplate. But I will say that a lot of people don't realize that when at the end of the Bush administration, the DoD thought they were ready to produce this system, was called GPALS, Global Protection Against Limited Strike. So it was specifically a space-based interceptor constellation to protect against Iran and North Korea. And there were bids by contractors to move ahead and actually build this. It was something like 4,500 interceptors that was thought to be ready to go. And, reportedly the Clinton administration, did not want to go that direction. And so they canceled the GPALS program and returned the bids unopened. But technologically, the United States has been in a position to put up a space-based interceptor constellation since 1993.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask about that next, because SDI was based on very primitive computing and technology compared to what we have today, right? I mean, it's 40 years later.
Yeah, it's something like 10 million times increase in the computing capacity. I'd have to look up specifically what it is, but I know that it was more than a millionfold increase in, compute per unit cost and compute per unit mass.
Well, the other thing that you said seems so important. The money that goes into fostering innovation doesn't just go away, and it doesn't just go into Golden Dome, right? It percolates out into the space economy, and companies develop innovations that are used. Some of those may return to the civilian world, right? You were talking about the sensors inside of cell phones, but others will go into reducing the cost of satellite launches, improving access to space, and again, helping create that Star Trek future for humanity.
So you're right. It almost always, this is the underappreciated aspect of arms races. People on the disarmament, crowd who believe that weapons cause war, always see the downside of arms races. But, arms races are essentially a strategy of, it's a Cold War strategy of exhaustion to see if you can outcompete the other person. And in the process, there's usually amazing technological advances on both sides that and then those swords get beaten into plowshares and become, very powerful. So the DCX, becomes, the Falcon 9, the Brilliant Pebbles becomes the first generation of Starlink. But it'll be no less important this time around because, everything about launch costs is basically launch cadence, everything. And so the more you can increase launch cadence, the cheaper launch costs is. And the more there's this thing called industrial production learning curve. So the more things you make, the more you learn how to do them, and that makes it cheaper to do other adjacent things. And so, there are going to be further important advances in rad-hardened electronics, in better sensors, in better, propulsion and the mechanisms to control propulsion. And then, this executive order, we haven't talked about, the other things, right? So in the current reconciliation bill, there's about 25 billion total, and really only about 5.6 billion of that is, I believe, going toward boost phase interceptors, which is still substantial. And it's only 1 year of funding. but that's more than we've seen in like 3 decades. So that's pretty substantial. And 5.6 billion is like a fifth of the Space Force budget. And this is the first real, you could say, offensive defensive capability, or weapon in space. So this will fundamentally change, their identity. But along the way, right, there's also in this reconciliation bill like 7.2 billion for space-based sensors, and another 2 billion for what is, called air-moving target indicators, which is basically space-based radar to track aircraft and missile threats. So these next generation delivery systems that the order talks about, which is going to be, the first time we'll ever have like global space radar, which is, itself unbelievably significant, right? On par with GPS. And the space-based sensors that are going to track these hypersonics and this proliferated warfighter constellation, right? We're now talking about, global sensing, optical and infrared, and a custody layer, and a laser communication layer that puts that across. All those things are already, right? I would say what the Space Development Agency was doing on the sensing side before the acceleration via Golden Dome is having an amazingly tonic effect on the new space industry, because with the government being, the first buyer for compute, the first buyer for launch of small satellite, the anchor customer for laser communication, pushing encryption, pushing on-orbit compute, pushing particular kinds of sensors, right? Once that market exists in the DoD, people naturally find other applications and other customers. And so things, Tim, that I fully expect, right, is we're going to have an absolute revolution in astronomy. So, right now astronomers are wringing their hands and worried about the proliferated satellites that are in orbit and causing streaks to their ground-based telescopes. But when you have proliferated thousands of satellites with cameras and laser communications, your ability to have a Earth-sized, aperture, with a super long baseline array for anything you want, whether it is RF or optical interferometry, we're now going to see eventually an unbelievable increase in our ability to look outside of ourselves. And it's not going to slow down. These, like, the same technology that is useful on a brilliant pebbles could be very useful in terms of impact surveying parts of the moon that we might want to mine to find out. They could be extremely useful in terms of like small point-to-point hopping, for control. The ability to track things is going to have, one application that I think is obvious is that these type of interceptors, you can use them. There's some amazing work by Dr. Phil Lubin on a concept called Pi. But you can use interceptors to slice and dice asteroids that would be a threat to Earth. So, it ultimately could have, useful existential implications. And I think we're going to want to, at some point, be able to service these. And so that's going to have a tonic effect on the space industry to be able to do rendezvous and proximity ops, to be able to do in-space servicing, to, do some, and eventually we're going to be, well, let me put it this way. We're already seeing increases in launch. We're already seeing increases in our desire to have space mobility and logistics. But as launch gets more frequent, launch becomes cheaper. And as launch becomes cheaper, our ability to conceive and execute more ambitious things, kilometer scale structures, regular trips to the moon, regular trips to capture small asteroids, all that becomes increasingly possible. So yes, spending on Golden Dome will not be confined to Golden Dome. It will have a tonic effect across the entire space economy.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely amazing implications. And a moment ago, you mentioned the uptick in space-based launches, right, for like satellites. So I wanted to get into that. There are around 15,000 satellites in orbit right now. Not all of them are functional, but still, the last number I had was 14,900 in orbit, right? And that is continuing to increase. Depending on whose projections you trust, that could be 30,000 to 60,000 satellites, most of those microsatellites, right, in the next decade or so. So space is continuing to fill with commercial enterprise. And I think that dovetails into another issue that, again, you've written about in Scramble for the Skies, which is this ongoing gray war in space, right? Where the US and I believe China and potentially Russia are basically kind of tweaking each other's satellites and causing trouble for each other by what they call threats on orbit and things like that. So it just seems to me like the more that is up there, the more there is that needs protecting. Now, in the case of Golden Dome, you're saying that that's not going to be for space-based threats, but I can't help but wonder if that might not be something that's added to it in the future.
Well, first of all, I've seen estimates, that within a decade there might be 100,000 satellites, and that does not consider in any of those estimates, Golden Dome, right? And even if you have the most limited system, for limited actors, right? That's typically around 4,500 space-based interceptors. But SDI under Reagan for fully, blunting an all-out nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union was 50 to 100,000 interceptors, right? So that would be double the highest estimate of what is in LEO. Now, yes, it comes with huge implications for space-based traffic management, of orbit, deorbit, of replenishing. Certainly, I think there's an inherent capability that these could be used in a very capable anti-satellite. I mean, they will have on the order of 6 kilometers of delta V, which is a lot of energy to basically go anywhere. And we're already seeing, like, the Chinese put up co-orbital satellites as bodyguard satellites to protect their space station. They've articulated that they're going to do that. So I think that's a related and important policy decision about whether or not we want to have a declaratory policy on that. That either way, that comes with very, very broad implications. It's worth noting that a Golden Dome that can deny a missile launch can also deny any kind of launch, and it can also deny any kind of return. And so, a system like this, as articulated by Dr. Ev Dolman in his wonderful book on astropolitics, essentially, means that low Earth orbit, is sort of the equivalent of a Malacca Strait to and from space, and that somebody who possesses a space-based missile shield, can embargo or deny space at will. And that has, again, pluses and minuses. I mean, in theory, you could make space a nuclear weapons of mass destruction free zone. You could largely cause every exoatmospheric ballistic missile to become a wasting asset. And if you can pull it off, you might have space superiority. But we shouldn't be arrogant and think that others couldn't follow and do the same. And that also leads to another danger, which is just like in hypersonics, right? Now that the United States has entered into this game and said we're going to do this, the risks of not taking it to completion are in my view, pretty bad, because if our rival power decides, hey, that's a great idea, I'm going to do it, and we don't, which is exactly what happened with hypersonics, we could be in quite a pickle.
Well, I wanted to ask if Golden Dome could potentially inspire workarounds, making it similar to the Maginot Line. China has ship-to-ship hypersonic missiles. Russia could deploy submarine-based hypersonics, and there may be many other types of alternatives that could essentially circumvent Golden Dome's limitations.
So, Tim, the reality of any kind of military competition is that it's always move, counter move, and there's never any final move that can't be countered. So, absolutely, if the United States takes this step, adversaries will do what they can to compensate, right? And you've mentioned some of them, but not all, right? So there are endo-atmospheric, hypersonic spaceplane delivery systems. There are, sort of supersonic submarine torpedo nuclear systems. There's always, backpack nukes. There are, things like, what Ukraine did to Russia of using, first-person view, quadcopters to attack, strategic delivery. There are all kinds of things you could do, to harass the satellites on orbit, suborbitally. All of those things require significant new development efforts and come at a cost of whatever else those countries wanted to spend on it. And until they know what Golden Dome is and how successful it may be, right? It puts anybody in the position of like, what do I do? Right? Do I invest here? Do I invest there? Right? And that stunning effect is itself great for a status quo power that, like the United States, that doesn't want the board to be changed. Right? So the more it delays investment, obviously there are going to be workarounds, but they're going to be costly. And of course, as we talked about, the easiest workaround is to just build more missiles. But that's to blow a hole in it and try to get through anyway. And historically it has been, cheaper to build more offenses than defenses, right? But you're still imposing costs, to buy all that stuff and probably still delaying war plans. And there are others, like Ross Centers was on a Beyond Earth thing yesterday, and he made what I think is an amazing quote, which is not to dispute Golden Dome. It's just to say that the DoD and the Space Force has to consider its strategic flank. He said, the moon makes the Golden Dome look like a Maginot Line from the back. And so I think it's really important, that at the same time we're considering, what Golden Dome can do for, the security, we have to also think about the strategic flank and the importance of the moon as we look, farther out. But, just to, emphasize the point, it's like, this is not some last, winning move that you throw down, right? This is the next iteration to what the other guy's done to try to put us in check. It reverses the problem so that, we now have the initiative and they have to respond to our initiative and us putting them in check. And of course, adversaries aren't stupid. They'll come up with interesting ideas. We can't know for sure what they are. When they do, again, we'll have to innovate and do something else. But what I do like about this, Tim, is for the first time, it really is putting the United States back in the position of taking an initiative that the others have to respond to, rather than just sort of, sitting comfortable where we're at, while everybody else, says, oh, I see how he's built his walls. Let me start pre-positioning how I'm going to throw things at him. Now they have to worry a little bit about what this is going to mean for them.
Well, this goes to the blue water versus brown water Navy, which is a concept you introduced me to, and for me, this puts things in such a perspective. Again, going back to Scramble for the Skies, this idea is something that you tackle in the book. The U.S. Navy is used to keep trade routes open across the globe, right? And so it sounds like a space-based missile shield and the infrastructure and attention that goes into that, right, could do the same thing for space. So we could help provide that stability in the space environment, not only for our own assets, not only for stuff like the 8,000 plus Starlink satellites that are up there, but the satellites I mentioned a moment ago. I think China has two different companies. One is planning 10,000, one is planning 20,000. That they want to have that as their equivalent of Starlink. We could help provide safety and security for those as well, right?
So, Tim, there's nuance to what you said. So, first of all, I agree strongly with the idea that the Space Force has the potential to act as a Navy that protects commerce. And I want to point out that the U.S. Navy does not protect commerce by, spending every minute waddling along, with our container ships as they transit the world, right? They protect it by being able to threaten retaliation if somebody messes with that ship, right? Could they stand in the way of an attack? Well, for some, but probably not for an anti-ship missile, right? What makes the Navy powerful, and certainly the Navy also could, in the same way that we're talking about embargo, shutdown, blockade, global trade, but the U.S. Navy typically doesn't do that. It typically does exactly the opposite. Even for adversaries, it has, like, there would be no China today if it weren't for the U.S. Navy, keeping the Pacific, an open zone and not a closed, series of economic empires. So I do foresee that even though you can imagine, nefarious uses of Golden Dome, and certainly if I were an adversary, I would imagine those. If you look at how the United States actually behaves, it is very likely that we would use this in a protective mode of the zone of free commerce and open political systems, which I think is a positive thing to do. Now, could a Golden Dome, attack an anti-satellite weapon that was coming to shoot down a Starlink? Maybe, but the problem, with any kind of space-on-space interception is that it typically creates a lot of debris. Now, the exception is actually in missile defense. And the reason why is that the rocket on its way to orbit doesn't have enough energy to leave its particles in orbit, and the descending space-based missile has just lost orbital energy to be able to dive down. And so neither part has, enough energy to put the majority of those pieces into any orbit, and that's also typically, very close to the atmosphere where, such an intercept happens. So fears about debris are not so acute in a missile defense mode.
Well, I want to return to the Oreshnik because, again, for me, this is probably the biggest impetus for Golden Dome. In November 2024, Russia launched the Oreshnik missile against Ukraine, marking the first use of a multiple independently targetable reentry vehicle, a MIRV, in combat. And Vladimir Putin threatened to launch more. Again, this was basically a small-scale ICBM. The media dialed it down and called it an IRBM to kind of quell potential panic, I think. It's a nuclear-capable device, although in that case, you'd mentioned fractional orbital bombardment. It was used in more of a kinetic mode, but this is a hypersonic ballistic missile that was used in combat with a MIRV warhead for the very first time. So just to kind of drive that point home, the U.S. and Russia have had comparable weapons for decades. Other nations now possess ballistic missiles. So what once was a very contained, I guess, logical, rational, somewhat predictable environment has now become very chaotic. So does that make Golden Dome a necessity?
Well, I think certainly that was one of the types of delivery systems that was likely very influential in making the White House think that it is a necessity. And just to bring that home, right, those were not nuclear weapons,
Yeah.
but it was a MIRV, long range, delivery system. And hypersonic glide vehicles, I don't know that these were hypersonic glide vehicles. Um, but hypersonic glide vehicles, even kinetic ones, pack tremendous power and have tremendous cross range. And so, you can imagine that like one one rocket with three hypersonic warheads, could target, the White House, the Congress, the Pentagon, right, as part of a decapitating strike. But the cross range, of potentially thousands of nautical miles potentially means that that one rocket, could target facilities, across the entire eastern seaboard.
Yeah.
And so and it's very, very hard to intercept something that's traveling that fast and maneuvering and where you don't know where it's going. The critics of a system like Golden Dome, point out, well, you could just have, wouldn't it be cheaper to just have terminal defenses rather than have to put up so many satellites in order to have the coverage to shoot down whatever you need? But having terminal defenses to defend every possible, target in the United States, especially your population, that would be far less economical and much harder to do technically, to hit something, in the terminal phase, especially if it's hypersonic, than to hit a MIRV weapon in the boost phase. So, the best place to do global missile defense has always been space. Now, whether or not that's a necessity, involves many broader questions of what else are you buying, and I don't mean what else are you buying in terms of systems. I mean, what other problems and interactions are you buying by building this system, right? And it, like I said, this affects everything. It affects whether or not our adversaries think we're developing an overwhelming anti-satellite capability, whether or not our adversaries, which I don't think we are, whether or not our adversaries think we are developing a shield that enables us to have a nuclear first strike with impunity, which has never been an interest of America. It involves third-party nuclear states who will be scared that this system will undermine the credibility of their nuclear deterrent. And then there are other interactions, Tim, that were very curious the first time around. There's a great book, I don't know if I have it on my shelf, by Aaron Bateman, Weapons in Space, that chronicles the first Cold War. And one of the fascinating interactions was how at the time, Europe, for the most part, was not warm to the idea of SDI, but largely because they thought that this would create exactly the sort of technological advantage that would allow the United States to get further ahead, particularly on electronics and sensors, which it did. So, I mean, there's some allies that I think should be jumping for joy, like Japan. I think, and probably Taiwan. For Japan, this is great because I think this, undermines their difficult decision about what they may need to do to protect themselves, and certainly provides a level of credibility and protection that didn't previously exist, and lessens the pressure on them that they may feel, to create their own nuclear deterrent against China. For Taiwan, I think, whatever this does, right? I think in one of your draft questions, you had talked about, might this force counters in other ways? Well, if you're right on the cusp of making a decision to buy ballistic missiles or hypersonic missiles, you'd have to think twice, right? You'd have to be like, is this a good idea? Or alternately, you'd have to say, this could still work, but I'm going to need like 5 to 6 times the number of missiles to get through this to have the same level of probability that my war plan is going to work, right? So one of the amazing things about this is it may force an adversary like China, to take a step back and think about whether or not they're going to have the force structure that they actually need to execute their war plans to get Taiwan. And so again, just a thought experiment for you is, I'm pretty sure that if the United States had to get into a conflict defending Taiwan, that would be way more than $800 million. I'm pretty sure that the cost of such a conflict would far exceed $1 trillion in all kinds of ways. But if you could cause that to be delayed by a decade because you've thrown over the table with some entirely new idea that makes China recalculate whether or not their war plan is going to work, then that 800 billion or 175 billion is probably a bargain in terms of a foreign policy outcome.
Yeah, Pete. On that note, why don't we close things down for today? We have blown many minds, and we have covered a lot of different possible ramifications of the Golden Dome. Let me thank you so much for your time. It is always a pleasure to have you on. It has been a long time. I want to have you back more in the future. I want to thank you for your tremendous career of service to our country. And I want to close by asking, what is coming up for you in the next, for the remainder of this year?
Well, I'm closing in on turning in my draft dissertation to my advisor. So we'll see how well that's received. But that will chronicle the history of the and causes of the Space Force and why it happened when it did. And in a few months from now, I'm going to have a new book coming out. This is what the cover looks like. Space Shock.
Oh, okay. Well, that right there, I'm going to interrupt. Usually I don't speak after I do the closing thing. So we are going to have to do another podcast on Space Shock. We'll do a couple of promos for it.
Absolutely. So yeah, that was 18 scenarios that we looked at, that we thought would be sort of Sputnik-like moments. And that'll be coming out as a book. So I'm looking forward to that coming out. And even before that, we'll be releasing a policy paper on, 3 scenarios plus kind of 2 bonus scenarios looking at nuclear weapons in space.
Okay. Space Shock. So yeah, I definitely want to do something on that. What you did with Scramble for the Skies, that was way ahead of the curve. So this, I'm sure, just moves that needle further out, right? So
it does. And, I will say also, listeners, if they don't have enough podcasts, we didn't talk about the intermediate book, which was The Next Space Race. And we have put the audiobook out as a series of podcasts on space strategy. So, if you, of course, I appreciate anybody who wants to buy the book. But if you want to, listen to it chapter by chapter, you can find that on the Space Strategy podcast.
Awesome. Pete, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Tim, it's been great. You and I have both been at this for a long time, and it's wonderful to be in conversation every single time.